the news hits. Social Security is reducing the amount of money that it can pay its recipients by over 12%, and at the same time, they're increasing the amount that they take out of everybody's paycheck by over 12%. And why? Because they've realized that today, they are no longer able to meet the obligations that were the promises that were started back in the 1930s. They realized that that promise now has to be broken. That's today. What we have on that day is a world in which that giant social experiment, that experiment that said that someone else is going to care for my future, that American statement that says that we the people have a government that's going to make sure that we're taken care of, that statement has just been proven incorrect. Now, this is not the first time that's happened, but it is a very important and very different time that this has happened, because at the same time, at the exact same moment, we also have nearly $19 trillion of debt. We also have an illiquid pension program. We also have an FDIC who's been insuring our bank deposits that is actually over-committed by over $6 trillion. And we have offshored assets. The corporations that have been moving money by the bucketfuls out of the country, those companies have their money safely in the hands of the British Isles, from whom we declared independence in 1776. Now, if that's the case, where did it go wrong? And is it something that's beyond the reach of going right? Is it possible that we can actually reclaim that beautiful mountaintop in Monticello, probably somewhere in March or April, when the dogwoods are blooming and when the azaleas are coming out and the rhododendrons are screaming through the forest with beautiful pinks and purples and whites? Is it possible that we hold these truths, that beauty, that nature, all of the wild that was surrounding that space, is it possible that that version of us still can show up? And you know what? We saw this coming. We actually did see it coming. What we didn't have is we didn't have a public sector. We didn't have a president. We didn't have a Congress who was willing to trust us, trust we the people, with the truth that said we're on a collision course with a really harsh reality. And now, we actually have the reality. And the good news is that Congress didn't tell us it was coming. The White House didn't tell us it was coming. But the markets did tell us it was coming, and they told us about this a long time ago. They told us about this way, 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 way back. Maybe back in, I don't know, the 1800s at the Treaty of Ghent. They told us about this when they formed the Federal Reserve in 1913. They told us about this in 1933 when they set up the Social Security Administration. They told us about this in 1971 and 1972 when they decided to change how our money works. They told us about this in 1974 when they said, don't trust pensions. They told us, and we didn't listen. So now we have a chance to do it a different way. We're going to start, we the people, forming a more perfect union. And we're going to take the best of what we know, we're going to take the experience of what we've had, and we're going to take the reality of this moment and transform it through an evolutionary process which will once again make humans great. In the 17th and 18th century, there was a recognition that there was a lot about the world around us that could be explained through observation and not through some outside authority telling us how to see the world. And not surprisingly, as part of the Reformation movement and otherwise, as people realized that you could throw off the shackles of an ecclesiastical system, that is the Pope telling you how to see the world, and the world is this way because the Pope says so. And then replacing that with monarchs who have the ability to go largely under the patronage of the religious orders, the same thing. We're going to tell you how to see the world. There's this emergence of a human impulse that says, if I can observe the world around me, I can observe how nature works, I can observe how objects fall, I can observe how birds fly, I can see how life goes through its own diversity, there must be an experiment about humanity that could be equally radical. And the equal radical experiment of humanity is what happens when we say, no more ecclesiastical systems, no more monarchy systems, what next? By 1830, Tocqueville called America the Grand Experiment. But prior to that, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and others called what was America an experiment. And the reason they called it that was there was a social idea that says humans have the ability to understand nature, they have the ability to understand the world around them through the scientific method. And that implies you take ingredients or variables that you think you understand, you put them together in a particularly interesting environment, and then you watch them. And you nurture them, you feed them, you grow them, you put them under light, you do whatever you want to do. But what happens in that experiment is things are expected to change. Things are expected to transform. That's what experiments are about. And so when America is described as a grand experiment, this is the audacious statement by a number of men who said, we are conducting what in their minds was the greatest experiment, not just a great experiment. They thought it was the greatest experiment. What happens when you take humans and you try to unconstrain the variables about the human operator and then play with the variables in the system? That's what the great experiment was. There are three founding documents that are really important to understand from this in terms of the building of the fabric of America. The three founding documents are the natural extension of what's happening against a much broader global impulse, which is the rejection of ecclesiastical systems in the church, rejection of monarchies, which many times were reinforced by ecclesiastical systems. And what they really represent is a statement that says that there's a new order, there's an evolution of human consciousness, there's an evolution of the human story, which is happening. And it's not happening in America, it's happening. America happens to be the proximate moment in time where the experiment can kind of land. And so these documents are actually a crescendo of human expression that lands in a particular place at a particular time, but it's in spite of where it is. It has kind of almost nothing to do with the fact it's in America. It's just that's what was going on, and that happens to be the fertile ground into which the seed of this new human potential is going to land. That impulse is in fact part of the extremely important narrative that actually underpins the reason why people are willing to sign on to the experiment. People are willing to get involved because there's this inertia that's happening in the system that says, we the people is a statement we can kind of feel like we can get behind because we the people were the revolutionaries in the Protestant Reformation, we were the revolutionaries in the monarchy revolutions, we were those people. Now we are declaring that we the people can do something. And so these documents play a very important role in defining an impulse that just is given language. The impulse is already there, it's already present, it's already in the system. And that impulse, together with this notion that by observing the world around you, there's so much more that you can learn. There are so many more systems to integrate. And it's not just a powerful elite that dictates to you, the people, how you have to live. There's a world that can inform what life is about. And it's an important part of what America is. The first one, which is most commonly accessed, is the Declaration of Independence, which is, we hold these truths to be self-evident. all men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the idea that somehow or another humans are capable of their governing without a monarchy, without somebody else telling them what to do. So this is the teenager going, hey, you know what? I'm on my own. I know what's going on and I can do what I'm going to do. So we've got the Declaration of Independence, which is a really robust document, not surprisingly, developed by the moral philosopher, statesman, very aspirationally minded Thomas Jefferson, who is more than happy to actually think big, think huge, and he is all about this wonderful, bold experiment. You also have the Federalist Papers, which become the Constitution. And the Federalist Papers were, interestingly enough, written often under nom de plume. So I find it fascinating that when the Constitution and the formative documents of how the actual business of America was going to be conducted was being drafted, the people doing the drafting were actually using Roman senator names. And they were making up Latin names as their nom de plume when they were writing the Federalist Papers. So they weren't necessarily subtle about telegraphing that they were not only building a republic, but they were actually explicitly building a Roman republic. And so there's this birth of an organization which has a lot of principles that come out of the classic Roman structures. So we have the Senate, and we have the notion of an executive, and while we don't have the chief executive being Caesar, we still have this sense of somebody who needs to be the iconic figure of power. But we need to undermine them at the same time with a very, very, very tightly controlled legislative that actually makes sure that the powerful doesn't get too powerful. So you have the best of Romans and the worst of Romans all coming together. And interestingly enough, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers was called Brutus. So we have Brutus, we have them all. They're all there. And what's interesting about the Constitution is the Constitution lays out a number of principles about social organization which are quite laudable. But intrinsic in the Constitution is also a statement that says, I don't entirely trust you. Right? So there's a tiny bit of mistrust, which is now woven into this interesting tapestry, so that yes, we believe that humans can be great, and yes, we believe that humans can achieve great things, but not too great, and not too many great things. And we're going to make sure that we have a system that says you can't get a runaway dictator, you can't get a runaway autocrat, you can't get a runaway anything, because we trust you, human. We hold these truths to be truth, almost. And then there's a third document that doesn't get much attention. And that third document is the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Now, for a man who spent his life railing about the advocacy for liberty and railing about how people needed to be unconstrained and without any limitations, it is somewhat ironic that Thomas Jefferson, the great aspirational draftsman of the Declaration of Independence, is also the author of the Statute of Religious Freedom. And the fact that he used freedom is interesting because he didn't speak of freedom very often. Most of his aspiration was about liberty. But Jefferson had a real problem with the principle behind religion. And as on the surface one might say religious a man as he had to be for social acceptability, because at the time it was totally inappropriate to actually come all the way out and go, I'm not supporting this. The document that establishes the Statute of Religious Freedom in Virginia, which becomes a very critical part of the principles of the foundation of the country, is the notion that you are free to practice a religion, but you are not free to impose upon others whatever your belief system is. Now, it's fascinating that we understand that the Statute of Religious Freedom was not about the separation of church and state. That's a post hoc illusion projected on the founding of America. What the Statute of Religious Freedom was about tolerance. It was about saying, you're willing and you're capable of doing what you're willing and capable of doing, but what you're doing cannot impinge on the liberty and the freedom of others. And so the Statute of Religious Freedom is a very important document because it lays out a moral fabric of how the social interactions of the country should be based. When we said we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, and we say that in 1776, isn't there another voice in 1776 that's actually saying something entirely different? Isn't there in The Wealth of Nations Adam Smith's mandate that says that laborers are required to create value, and that there is a new class, replacing the monarchy, replacing the ecclesiastical structures? Isn't there a new class called the industrialist, called the financier? Isn't there a new class that's coming in? And are they using this cunning tool called the corporation, which rather than holding people accountable is expressly set up to limit liability so that the human isn't responsible for his or her action? Because this anonymized other, this ephemeral construction called a corporation, is set up expressly for the purpose of enrichment of that individual who has no accountability. Is it possible that 1776, that Declaration of Independence, that freedom from tyranny, freedom from monarchies, freedom from taxation, freedom from troops that come in and actually occupy your homes, is that freedom actually emerging exactly at the same time that a new form of indenture is being born? Did we cast off King George only to take on King Morgan? See, when we think about it that way, when we see the world that is emerging in 1776, we learn some very important things, because truth wasn't truth. And the truth that came out of the pen of Jefferson actually wasn't entirely true either. We held truth to be self-evident, but we held truth to be self-evident for those like us. Because in the formation of America, those who came, the destitute who came, freeing from debtor's prison, the religious persecution that drove people into enclaves in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and other places. In fact, my own ancestors, David Martin, the first ancestor to come across, who left while his father was still imprisoned for his faith in Europe. Is it the case that that freedom impulse actually brought us into a land where we didn't consider what it meant to be we the people? We actually considered ourselves to be the individual that needs to survive, the individual that needs to flourish, the individual that needs to connect and be supported, but not we the people, not a consensus of a better us. So what we have in 1776 is a very interesting convergence of a very clear expression of freedom from. But we actually didn't define very well what we were free to. And so here's the tiny little problem. The tiny little problem is something that we can understand if we think about a doctor and a hammer in our knee. When a doctor hits our knee and flexes our knee, we actually call that a reflex. And the reflex is actually something that happens at the spinal cord. It doesn't involve the brain, it happens at the spinal cord, and what it does is it says there's a stimulus, and I'm going to create a response. But the problem with the reflex is it's not considered. I don't sit there and ponder, oh, there's a hammer, it's coming towards my knee, what would I do? I merely know that there's a stimulus, and my muscles and my nerves conspire to have a response. But the problem with that is that it is not governed by thought. It's not governed by consciousness. It's actually governed by merely an avoidance of an aversive stimulus. Freedom is a reflex. It takes something intolerable, something suboptimal, something that's not the best of us. And what we do is we say, definitely not that. So we reject it, we throw it off, we cast it aside. We use language, as we did in the Declaration of Independence, of separation. But the problem with a reflex is there's another half of a reflex. There's this other thing, and there's a whole bunch of compensatory frameworks inside the human body that says, while my knee is jumping on one side, the rest of my body is responding. There's an entire stabilization action that's taking place exactly at the same time as the reflex is happening. And if we don't think about what that is, we can reject one form of tyranny, we can reject the monarchy, we can reject something that we find impalatable. But the flip side is that there is something else that's actually becoming stronger, something else that's actually taking in that energy, which says the reflex is happening over here, there's a stabilization impulse happening somewhere else. The Declaration of Independence was the reflex. The wealth of nations, Adam Smith, the birth of the corporation, the hegemony of the corporation was the stabilizing impulse. Because now that we don't have to serve the master as a monarch, we now get to serve a new, more diffuse, more anonymous, more remote master called the financier, called the corporation, called the employer, called the industrialist. And see, what happened was the birth of America, co-emergent with 1776, the birth of the corporation, allowed the first seed that fell into the fertile ground of America not to be liberty and the pursuit of happiness. The first seed that fell into the ground was, this is the first time we could do the experiment of a nation built on a corporation. When you say it that way, it's somewhat chilling, because we now want to talk about the role of influence and how much money got spent to get people into office, and how much governments are controlled by special interests and they're controlled by finance. But we, the people, created an experiment where we, the people, in the rejection of monarchies and tyranny, actually created the system. Each one of us, each farmer that sold cotton, each farmer that sold tobacco, each industrialist that encouraged the formation of the iron industry and the coal industry and the rail industry and the electricity industry, each one of us actually watered and fertilized and cared for the experiment that was not about the best of humanity. It was about this other thing, this other story. And that story was fueled by something else that happened at the birth of America. See, at the birth of America, Thomas Jefferson talked about religious freedom being a very important reality, and that was an accommodation, because Jefferson wasn't that concerned about religion for himself. He actually didn't wake up every day kind of really wondering what was going on and what hymns were going to be sung on Sunday. He was actually on the other side of the fence, only capable of speaking about religion to make sure that he accommodated those who needed him to have the right lingo and the right jargon. He needed to appeal to an audience that actually had a very clear sense of the preeminence of religion. And Jefferson, in his Statute of Religious Freedom, once again triggered a reflex that said, we're not going to have a papacy, we're not going to have an ecclesiastical government, we're going to have a world in which we're going to have tons of tolerance for religion. So if you go back and look at the two real deep founding impulses, there is a religious impulse, which is a very robust thread. And we think of the Massachusetts colony, we think of what happened in the Northeast with the puritanical movements, which, by the way, were in many respects a very ironic thing. These were almost the Taliban of the time. These were religious extremists who were so extreme that they couldn't really get along in most of the European kind of gestalt. So they actually kind of got on boats and went away. And it's very ironic that religious extremism was one of the core threads, which was the founding root inside of the America story. And then you had this other very mercantile impulse, which was the British East India Company, but ultimately the Virginia Company in the case of the United States, where the Virginia Company sends people over, they find the James River, they find tobacco, and as the British they loved to find things that you could smoke or that you could drink, and it turns out they found something lovely to smoke. So you have the birth of this mercantile impulse. And so at its outset, in the 17th and early 18th century, what you really have inside of the American story are two stories. One is religious escapism, and the subtext of that is religious extremism. I mean, remember, we burned women at the stake. We hung people, we killed people, that kind of thing, which we now think of as, oh my God, nobody does that except religious extremists. Yes, we did that. And then you have the other impulse, which is land of the free, home of the brave, kind of let's go off and make our fortunes. And so those are the two things that really drive what becomes the story of America. We were populated by people who were suffering religious persecution, were economically disadvantaged, people who had actually been disentitled. So these are enormous numbers of relatively downtrodden people who came over and found in America not a land of opportunity, they found a refuge. And so a lot of the storyline that we tell ourselves about what America is a very fascinating story which doesn't have a lot of truth in it. This was not bold and brave. This was actually downtrodden and oppressed, who came to the shores and found places where they could hide away in their communities and in their villages and stay in a place of relative anonymity. And ironically, that anonymity, which is the impulse that says it's really about my self-interest and my preservation, is a thread that starts weaving into the fabric of the American story as well, which is, while we do have communities, the communities are small and largely about our own self-interest and our own preservation. But what you have is a world in which the idea of common interest, which was very communally centric, was something that was very much a part of the religious environment. You have houses that burn down that are rebuilt by the community. You have barns that fall over or are burnt down that are rebuilt by the community. There's this really strong religious sense of mutual aid. But inside of the religion of that day, we had lost the intermediary. We had lost the papacy. We had lost that notion that somewhere there's a bishop, or there is an archbishop, or there is somebody who takes care of us. And now all of a sudden, our not only lives, but our mortality are our responsibility. And we talk about the Protestant work ethic as a way that fueled the engine of the economy, but we don't talk about the fact that the Protestant work ethic had inside of it also a fear of death and a notion that heaven, an aspirational some other, some better, something else out there that's better than what we have here, is the motivation for our behavior. And while we were taught that somehow or another we were supposed to live in this world so that we could actually one day get the rewards of the world beyond, the same industrialist that was there to accommodate the replacement of the monarchy and the replacement of the ecclesiastical orders, that same industrialist knew that if they could just find the right balance, Adam Smith talked about this as the polarization between the rent extractor and the rent provider, his interesting definition of labor. If we could just hit the right balance, we could give people enough to sate their core expectations, their core needs, and their core desires, but we wouldn't give them too much. We wouldn't make it too good for them. We wouldn't have too much pursuit of happiness because they're being told on Sunday they don't need to pursue happiness because one day happiness is going to come on a cloud with a harp with wings. So the present was not what we made the best of because we knew that the future was going to be better. But what if the present is what we have? What if we, the people? What if life? What if liberty? What if the pursuit of happiness? What if these things are meant to be today? Well, we didn't hold that to be true. And every system that we had at the inception of the country reminded us daily that there was an elusive other. There was a somewhere else. There was a better something somewhere to aspire to. And at the same time, we have this beautiful impulse born largely of Adam Smith, which was this idea that we have just found a land with all these free options. Never mind the first communities that lived there, never mind the fact that there were forests and there were other things going on there. We found a free land, and as a free land, we had the most amazing mercantile impulse, which says all we have to do is cut down the trees, all we have to do is plow the fields, and then voila, we have an agriculture economy. The root of what made that economy work, it was actually the timber that was the old growth forests of America, which created a military efficiency so that the ships that were part of the mercantile defense, which were the Navy, of the United States, those ships were built with timber that was so robust that they were called Ironsides. And they were called Ironsides because the cannon could not get through the wood of the old growth forests of America. And that, interestingly enough, was the irony of how America was also born, which doesn't get discussed very much, which is we were the beneficiaries of unharvested timberlands that stretched as far as the imagination could go. If you look at the emergence of the Jefferson philosophical impulse, that impulse comes from a citizen farmer. Jefferson loved to think of himself as a bit of aristocracy in how he lived, but he liked to think of himself as a citizen farmer. So he was very much of a passive, very much more of an introspective and thoughtful person. On the other hand, when you have mercantile impulses that are being threatened, and it is real coin on the line. This was actually people who were tradesmen who were in the active seafaring trade of the latter part of the 18th century. These people actually were about to lose massive amounts of money. And it's these groups that actually say, you know what we can do is we can arm people. And rather than using our intellect, we can use gunpowder. And so the American Revolution is driven largely by the mercantile protectionism aided by gunpowder. And it's not really driven by the moral philosophy of a guy sitting on the top of a hill in Virginia thinking about what would be the human potential. And if you look at what emerges in the period of time from 1773 to 1776, during this period of time we have this convergence of two very different strains. A strain that on the one hand is saying, let's think our way out of this mess, and then a strain on the other hand that says, you know what, bullets are just a lot more expedient. And so bullets backed the banks, backed the businesses, backed the economic interests. The moral philosophy was safely out of harm's way, further inland, up on the top of a hill, where somebody was thinking about a better humanity. And so the First Continental Congress that comes together at Carpenter's Hall is coming together to actually build a consensus around the idea that something is going to change. And while there's not a definition of exactly what it is, there are elements of what we know are going to be what's put into America. There is a very clear statement that we are not going to continue to tolerate the armed intervention of taking of vessels off the sea. We're not going to tolerate the imposition of British forces coming in and demanding quarter. We're actually going to say that our resources are ours and they are not available to be taken at will. So there's a protectionist impulse, which is part of that first gathering. An additional piece of that gathering is the early conversations of what would a country look like? How would we organize a political system and a governance system that would actually make a replacement to, not necessarily a full transformation of, because remember, there was a discussion about the possibility of having a monarch in America. So these are conversations, these are not foregone conclusions. When we get to the Second Continental Congress, we now have a very clear statement that says we are doing this thing. It's not an idea anymore. We are going to launch a country. We are going to separate. And 1776 really serves as a line in the sand, which is the launch of the country. And that launch of the country wins on the side of violence, not on the side of the philosopher. And what you see happening from 1776 all the way through 1780 is this ongoing conflict that's happening behind the scenes, which is, what does a country look like if we form one? That's happening in a conversation that's happening in New York and Philadelphia and areas in Virginia. And what's happening in the Northeast, in Massachusetts, and then in New York, and then it spreads all the way down the East Coast, is the violent conflict that's happening between the British and the American forces, and that violent conflict is happening usually at centers of trade. And that's not surprising, because it was in fact the bankrolling of the battles that actually created the incumbent voices that would ultimately form the country. And so patronage became a very important, inextricably linked to violence thread that's happening as well. We have, on the one hand, a large group of ordinary farmers and citizens who are still trying to go about their lives. Many of them, by the way, are thought to be enemies of the state. Remember, American citizens thought to be enemies of the state because they were loyalists and they were sympathizers to the British. They didn't have a problem, and they were getting along quite fine. There was nothing wrong with their lives. They didn't see a tyrannical influence in their lives because their lives were actually just going about a daily life. It was the economic interests that fueled the conflict, which then allowed them to set the tone for what became the independent nation that was the America that we now think of today as a land of a free, a home of a brave, the entity that's controlled by these kind of very powerful forces that are not necessarily representative. And remember, as much as we talk about democracy, then as now, we do not have representational democracy. We still have a world in which influence and power gets then pushed through a system which isn't representational. The bloody revolution is won by America. So the story we tell is we won. Nobody actually knows what winning was. We don't know what we won. But we know that we won by the British actually saying, we're done. There's a fascinating story inside of that, which is, did we win? Was Washington really this prevailing hero? Or was it possibly the case that Britain was stretched so thin that they actually ran out of money? And we don't ever examine the real cause and effect of these kinds of questions, but the truth is that Britain was at war not with America, but Britain was at war generally. And it was spread around an enormous amount of the world, and it was in conflict in an enormous amount of the world. And what happens is that you have, at the exact same time that the American Revolution is ending, you have the emergence of the maritime conflict with France. And it turns out that ships can only go one direction. They can either go kind of south and fight in the Mediterranean and go to the Straits of Gibraltar, or they can go all the way across and try to fight in South Carolina. And it turns out that there's a division of resources. There are national coffers that are draining very fast, and there's a hemorrhage of resources that are going out. And so whether we won or whether Britain actually just ran out of resolve and finances is an open question. And I think that the truth is there's a bit of both, but let's just say we won because we like that story. Here's the problem with the story. We have a world in which in 1805, there is an emergent need to actually send goods and services around because we have to build revenue for this country. We don't have domestic revenue to actually offset everything, so we still need trade. So we have a need to create an economic infrastructure which is now going to compete with the very colonial power we just rejected. So we have this economic interest that shows up, 1805 comes along, and at the exact same time, Britain is locked into a conflict with France, and the French conflict is increasing the cost both on France and on Britain. And in 1805, it gets so bad that the French inspiration that gave rise to Jefferson's philosophy that led to the formation of America is running headlong into the Napoleonic conflicts. And Napoleon goes so far as to say, I'm out of money, I've tapped everything I've got, and what I'm now going to do is I'm going to tax swampland. There's a very famous decree, the 1805 Swamp Decree, which just cracks me up because Napoleon is so desperate that he needs to get money for his wars that he tells people that he's going to now tax their land based on the improved value of swampland if it had been drained. He's actually saying, let's assume that your land is drained, let's assume you're farming it, and I'm going to tax you as though you're farming a swamp. You've got that going on, and you have America now pumping out agriculture resources. So there's a huge trade imbalance where France doesn't have enough trade to actually pay for its war. America has tons of trade, it's paying for its war, it's all working out great, and then what happens? We go back to war. The funny thing is that Americans kind of forget the fact that our national anthem was born of that war, not of the battle for independence. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed, blah, blah, blah. When we sing that song, the bombs bursting in air, the rocket's red glare, gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. That was the Baltimore Harbor, and that was in the 1800s, not the 1700s. But people think that somehow or another we finished the business in 1776. But we didn't finish the business. What we did was we actually started the business in 1776, and we finished it in 1815. That's a long time to be in conflict. That's a long time to be working out what you think this country is about. And by the way, in 1815, we weren't sure we were actually all the way there either. And so the irony of kind of the broader social narrative is that we think of independence as something that happened, and we don't see that the revolution, in fact, itself was an evolution. It went from the impulse to be free to the impulse that says we want to have hegemonic power. And it was a impulse that started out at that human expression of let's get rid of tyrants, and then it became a let's adopt tyrants. But the tyranny that we adopted was a tyranny of corporate patronage. Because while we were free of the monarchy, and while we were allegedly part of this great trading experiment, what we realized is that we still had to turn for somebody else to take care of us. And so what we looked to was the only thing we knew to look to, which was government. But government didn't have resources. It didn't have influence. It didn't have power. And the people who had it were the merchants and the bankers and the traders. So in 1815, the great experiment that Jefferson framed as an amazing opportunity for the humanist ideal to manifest in the earth, which is how hyperbolic he was. This was humans' crowning achievement. That was actually hijacked by the privatization of the banks in France, the privatizations of the banks in Great Britain, and the always have been privatizations of the banks in the Americas. That was what we got. That was the starting point. And our emergent economy realized that war was a really, really major economic driver. And so the fascinating thing is the American story has companies like DuPont. Great chemical company today, right? No. Gunpowder manufacturer. All of the stories we tell ourselves have these beautiful cover stories of industrialism and the great stories of the can-do spirit of America. But beneath all of it is the fact that we spent, and it's so important to see this, we spent a generation at war. America was not born, it evolved. And it evolved through the cunning use of gunpowder. And that was the founding of the Great Experiment. Into that experiment, we see a number of things inserted right at the beginning that start to take us off of that Jeffersonian ideal, that beautiful statement of possibility. We see that the industrial input into America came at the expense of a famine in Europe, where we had migrants coming from Europe, and they could work in sweatshop conditions in the Northeast, and they could work in insufferable and intolerable industries that no one would want to work in, their own hell on earth. They could stoke the furnaces, which ultimately drove the steam engines, which ultimately drove the wheels of industry into motion. And those immigrants who left famine were able to get enough to eke by, but they did not get an American dream. They traded one nightmare for another. We know that there were First Nations all across the country who were inconveniently in the way of accessing resources. And so rather than finding ways to embrace and accommodate their wisdom of how to manage and steward the land, our impulse was to say, You know what? We need the railroad to go through your land, and we need to actually make sure that we can feed the workers on that railroad, so we're going to shoot your buffalo, and we're going to do all of those things to take from you, not to include you. We the people didn't mean people who didn't look like they were European. We the people meant some other something. And by the way, if we look at the period of time from the mid-1700s all the way up to the mid-1800s, the first 100 years pre the Revolution all the way up until the Civil War, that we the people did not include the people who were chained on ships and brought over from Africa. The engine of growth, the engine of economic success, the engine that put in motion all of the great American productivity that was chained to boats and then brought to an America that was not a land of the free and the home of the brave. In fact, it was a land of shackles, and it was a land of being beaten, and it was a land of having your life extracted from you. We did not believe in life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. We believed in life for those who had the approval of the consensus. We believed in liberty for those of the establishment who actually had the right to dictate dominion over. We had the pursuit of happiness, but the pursuit of happiness only for those who actually were authorized to be happy. And it was the trail of tears that marked the first 40 years of the 1800s. It was the trail of tears at auction houses where slave families were separated. That's the engine that built the great American experiment that said, we the people, these truths, self-evident, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. That's what drove us into our current condition. And then, for those of us who actually were supposed to be the beneficiaries of life and the pursuit of happiness, that wonderful Protestant echo of the you're gonna die and there's a better beyond led us into a very insidious innovation that was also part of the American tradition. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is actually what we keep telling ourselves, but what we have is the trail of tears. What was that? That was the massacre of First Nations. We have the importation of laborers to go into the mines and into the sweatshops and into the giant industrial behemoths and the canals that had to be dug and the steel mills that had to be built. And we had this callous neglect for humanity. And so all of a sudden the disparity that exists between life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and gosh, there aren't a lot of happinesses and there's not much living, and the economic driver is actually the fear of death. So underpinning all of our storyline is a growth of an industry that says that we the people are about the fear of death every bit as much, if not more, than we are about the opportunity of life. Those stories are part of the American fabric that leads us to a place where we're willing to say that there is an economic motivation that is more important than living. And it is the reason why we don't have a problem in the 1860s when the economic interests of the South are coming into conflict with the economic interests of the North. It's not surprising that we turn guns against each other, because we've already spent a generation or two reinforcing that life is in fact less important than the economic interest that is in fact defining the social agenda. What we have by the time we get to 1815 is we have sovereign treasuries that have been drained, and so private banking becomes a very important part of funding the business of both an agrarian growth cycle credit market and an industrial northern market that is about industry and long-dated assets. Those two worlds are happening through private banking. The other industry that's happening is a very interesting unifying industry, and that is the industry of life insurance. Now, life insurance is not discussed when we think about the American story, but it needs to be, because during the period from 1815 to 1860, it was one of the fastest growing industries, and it was ubiquitous across all cultures, across all communities throughout America. Life insurance was a unifying force. And it was so significant that during both the Industrial Revolution as well as the Civil War, it was the interests of life insurers that was constantly defended, and constantly reinforced. And they become not only a heavily influential body, but they become the people who define the duration of things that happen in ordinary life. They determine the dates of when you're productive and when you're not productive anymore. They build the expectation that there's a someone else, somewhere else, that is going to take care of you. It was in fact an actuary who came up with the idea that you could measure the likelihood of living, and you can compare lives to each other, and you could bet the difference between how one person was going to live and ultimately die and how another person was going to live and die. And it was America that actually served as the fertile birthplace for an innovation that actually only started in the 1780s, right about the time that the country started. Now, if you think about it, it's a very interesting thing to put in the backdrop of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that we're going to create an economic model based on death. We're going to build an economic engine that becomes so important. $2 billion were the bets against life. More money than the collective value of most other industries. Agriculture, iron, rail. $2 billion. And that was in 1880, we the people saying we were going to energize more about death than we were about life. And we have to understand that for the America that we have today to be understood, it requires a recognition that we didn't fall into this by accident. This was designed and architected into the experiment of the great experiment. And so for us to critique today where we are without understanding that the assumption underpinning this was that someone else had to take care of our lives because we couldn't. We then put in place life insurance, we then put in place pensions, then we put in place unions, we put in place all of these other machinations, which are not about life, not about liberty, not about the pursuit of happiness, and all of these are manifestations of the truth of the American story, which was fueled around the price of life being less than the price of economic progress. In 100 years, from the birth of actuarial sciences to the tyranny of an insurance system that said, now we don't have a monarch to care for us, now we don't have a god or a pope to care for us, now we have to care for ourselves. What we did was we placed our faith and confidence not in life, not in liberty, not in the pursuit of happiness, but we placed our confidence in a corporate financial model that said that something about today is not adequate to ensure my future, so I'm going to pay today. I'm going to indenture myself today for a future that I'm not even going to experience. That is a future that is going to be for the someone else somewhere else. And who is the beneficiary of that policy? Oh, sure, the Scottish Presbyterians wanted it to be widows and orphans. That's who was supposed to be the beneficiary. But if you look at who the real beneficiary was, the real beneficiary was banking systems that actually wanted to make sure that your debt could be paid for your overconsumption in life. It sounds so good to say, don't you care about your children after you die? Wouldn't you love to make sure they're okay? Don't you care about the wife that you leave behind, Mr. Laborer? Don't you care about their family? Don't you care about what their experience is going to be? But that was the marketing propaganda. The substantive reality was that the reason why we, the people, decided to make life insurance a core industry in America was because we were being taught to consume beyond our means. And we knew that in life we'd overconsume, and therefore we would run up debt. And since we'd run up debt, we'd have to be able to pay it off. We really did this because we, the people, did not believe in life, did not believe in liberty, and did not believe in the pursuit of happiness. We actually turned something around entirely on its head. It was about not our life, our fear of death. It wasn't about liberty. It was our freedom from tyranny. It wasn't about pursuit of happiness. It was about pursuing things, artifacts, property, land, gadgets, things that would make us independent. We weren't pursuing happiness. We were pursuing our ability to protect ourselves from the outside world, from each other, from the things that actually could influence our lives. And we bet on the side of death, not on the side of life. And for 100 years, we went through a process of expanding the country through war. We went through a process of making sure our ports were open for trade through war. We built industries so that they could very rapidly pivot from an industrial frame to build out tractors and steam engines and locomotives, the ability to pivot rapidly into supplying military equipment. And so every time we'd get into another conflict, we'd have this upsurge of economic activity, and that upsurge of economic activity needed to be financed somehow. And so through this process of constantly being in conflict and then constantly running up a national debt, which then constantly needed to be paid for over a period of time, we built another model. And the other model was actually something that was never in Jefferson's mind. In fact, Jefferson was a critic of the fact that European monarchs had built systems where they would go to war, they'd run up large debts, private enterprise would come in and bail out that particular monarch, and as a result, become the, in fact, de facto rulers of the country, because the private sector would actually now have a king or a monarch beholden to them. Jefferson was railing against that, and 100 years later, that's exactly what we had in the United States. After the panics that took place in the late 1800s, what we created was a world in which banks needed to bail out governments. And when banks bail out governments, guess who starts to run the government? The banks. William Jennings Bryan, considered to be one of the great American orators of the latter part of the 19th century, very famously had a speech of the Cross of Gold. And the Cross of Gold was a speech that was really about challenging what had been a period of time that started in the 1840s, so 1848, 1849, which is when gold in California fueled the notion of a gold-based economy and a gold-based currency. Silver was more accessible, silver was much more prevalent. The gold standard was supported by people who wanted longer dated assets, and so the northern bankers and the people who were defining long duration assets were actually interested in a gold standard. The agrarian South wanted a silver standard. The conflict around it came in with the Cross of Gold speech, which is one of the most defining speeches of the American both social evolution but also economic evolution. When to reinforce the accessibility of the story of gold, the Yukon territories and Alaska become part of the story. But interestingly enough, they're just part of the story. The other part of the story is something that was happening to a neighbor very, very, very far to the south, and that was Australia. Australia happened to have gold rushes that seemed to co-occur with American gold rushes, and I always find that to be fascinating, that gold seemed to find its way into the storyline within 2 or 3 years of each other in the 1840s and then again in the 1890s. So there's a storyline that's built in the 1840s, and then we have the Civil War, and then back in the 1890s, we have a story of gold coming into existence as a primary driver of the people who control the gold, control the economy. That story is born in 1898. William Jennings Bryan is the last populist guy going, hey, hold on a second, let's not go down that path, let's not repeat the sovereign monarchy treasuries of Europe, let's let the average person have a metal that they can use, like silver, and let's let everybody have access to the monetary system. And that gets shut down with the election in 1904. In 1904, standing next to the president at the inauguration, are executives from gold mining companies? Nope. Transport companies? Nope. Standing next to the president on the stand when he's taking the oath of office in 1904 are life insurance executives. And life insurance executives are supporting two different things happening at the same time. The one thing that they're supporting is the emergence of a gold standard, because they want to have hard assets to support their investments, but they also want the speculative returns from running speculative investments around mines. So they're quite happy to have gold, and they do not want a populist silver. And the other thing that they want is they want to solve a really interesting problem. And the problem they want to solve is that the average life expectancy for the insured blue-collar worker, the industrial worker in America, is about 30 years. And they want to figure out a way to get an investment that matches the duration of the life of a worker so that they can actually get paid a premium, but schedule a policy to stop right before that benefit would be paid. 30 years. Now, the funny thing is, people today sign agreements every day for 30-year mortgages. They sign 30-year loans. They sign 30-year this. They sign 30-year that. And none of them stop and ask the question, why did we pick a 30-year duration? And it becomes super important for us to understand that everything about our economy, when I said is driven by death, everything about our economy, including how we buy the homes in which we live, was actually predicated on a structure that was designed around death. In 1906, there's very famously the Millionaires' Congress. And it was called that. It was called the Millionaires' Congress. It was when all of the patrons that had actually been part of this Reconstruction period and all the patrons that had been part of the industrial hegemonic movement within the country actually go into office. And so they write laws at that point in time, which, guess what? Serve we the people of the United States? No. In 1906, the Millionaires' Congress writes laws to support the millionaires of America, not to support laws of the people of America. And it's not by accident that in that period of time, 1906, 1908, and 1910, there is an increasing involvement where the political system and the banking system and the insurance system are all working hand in glove together to figure out a way not to serve the growth of the American people and not to serve the growth of the American economy generally, but they're actually looking at their own self-interest. But during that period of time, there's also a gathering of people who are actually bankers and insurance companies that actually get together and hold a series of meetings that are discussing how to take a extra congressional and extra legislative grab at power. And what they're doing is trying to understand how they can construct a private system that would not be beholden to anyone, and through that system control the economy of the United States. That ultimately, in 1911 to 1913, becomes the core of what we now know as the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was actually quite practical. It was the marriage of banking interests that needed to figure out how to get a money supply into them, and the assets created by the banking system, which is debt that actually needed to be purchased by life insurers. So the Federal Reserve was this interplay between a necessity to manufacture assets on the one hand, and a necessity on the part of the banks to find out how to get resources in excess of the gold that they had. Because what the Federal Reserve did was it created a mechanism to tie two industries together, the banking and the insurance industry. And it was the union of those two dynamics, which is really what is the motivating impulse behind the Federal Reserve. So it was a land grab from the standpoint of taking power from the government of the United States. And the reason why it was set up the way it was so that the Federal Reserve had the ability to establish every form of policy. It actually was a way to turn the entirety of America into an economic driver to build wealth for a very, very defined set of the population. And this was so egregious, that by 1904, 1905, and 1906, even Congress, and let's think about the Congress, the Millionaires' Congress. This was not we the people. This was not agrarian. This was we the people Congress. That Congress, made out of nothing but aristocracy. This Congress was so offended by the influence of business and the influence of banks and the influence of insurance companies that it actually set up a commission to investigate what went wrong with America. And the Peugeot Commission very famously mapped out what was called the interlocking directorates. The interlocking directorates were the different chairmen of all the iconic companies in America, who all seemed to all have the same ultimate reporting structure, which ultimately reported back up to the banks and back up to the insurers. And the Peugeot Commission spent years investigating what it considered and what Congress considered and what most of the American public considered to be an extra congressional, extra legislative, extra constitutional power grab by a few industrialists. And the tragedy is they actually concluded that that really happened, that there was a real hijacking of America. And in 1906, and then again in 1912 and 1913, we the people actually made an inquiry into this American experiment, and we the people concluded that the experiment had been hijacked. We had the Anderson Commission, we had the Peugeot Commission, and they showed that the interlocking directorates, the same people who actually controlled the banks and controlled the insurance companies and controlled the industrial output, the same people who were all at the helm of all of the major industries were in fact the ones that were controlling the America that was once the land of the free, the land of opportunity, the land of we the people, the land of the great human experiment. And guess what? Nothing was done. We had the information, it was publicized, it was in the media, and we the people sat and said, that's too big for us to deal with. With the formation of the Federal Reserve, there is a transition in language. And the transition in language goes from the great experiment, the Tocqueville principle of democracy and the great American experiment, and it turns into the great age. And that's a very different set of language, because when you have this greatest age, and then we have in the First World War the greatest war, or the war to end all wars, we have this view that is now supported by those who now control the realm. And that's the bankers and the insurers who are really locking in on their control of the realm. They, together with the industrialists, really do dictate this idea that we can solve everything. And so the great age of great everythings, and everything is hyperbolic. Our sky rises get larger, our landscapes get bigger, our cities get more prolific, they get more crowded. We just have great everything. And this great age that comes along in 1913 actually is interrupted in part by the First World War. But the irony is, the First World War hits America precisely at the right time, because while Europe is watching its infrastructure get wiped out by massive amounts of bombing campaigns and burns and everything else, America's rise to economic power was as much the fact that it wasn't bombed as it was that America was somehow technologically or industrially superior. We just had infrastructure. And so as we go through the First World War, there's this beautiful story that we tell ourselves that leads up into the 20s, where we talk about the roaring 20s. Everything's building and everything's belching smoke and everything is working, and we've got this massive, massive infrastructure that's churning out this economy. That economy was a byproduct of the absence of a global economy because Europe had been bombed to oblivion. And so it's not by accident that we see the American growth happening once again, not because of superiority, but because it had an infrastructure to use that was intact. Where World War I had made the infrastructure of Germany and the infrastructure of France and the infrastructure of Italy and the infrastructure of Great Britain all compromised, we actually had an untouched infrastructure. So, as Americans love to do, we narrate the story of being better, but better was a result of everybody else being worse. And what you see emerging in that period of time is a worldview that says America is an economic engine, not a philosophical statement of moral possibility. That's so critical to understand, because what we do then is reinforce that story through the 20s. And consumption becomes king. and overconsumption becomes king, and large parties and large buildings and large icons are built. And all the way up through the 20s, you have this happening until all of a sudden something happens. And what's the something that happens? The Great Depression. So the Great Depression is born of this union between banking and insurance companies that are driving a phenomenon that hadn't been seen before, which is a debt-based economy. And what you have is an acceleration of overconsumption. People are buying things, they're building things, they're doing all sorts of things, but they don't yet know what it is to live in a world defined by debt-denominated currency. And because of that, speculation is reckless and rampant and ultimately collapses in the Great Depression. In the period between 1929 and 1933, the public response is something has gone fundamentally wrong. And the something that went fundamentally wrong was correctly identified as a banking and insurance system that were interlocked. And there was something fundamentally about that that people mistrusted, and they were right in mistrusting it. But the problem is people didn't actually understand precisely what it was that was wrong. They just had a hunch that maybe something in the early part of the 1900s had been hijacked, and they had a hunch that there was something about that that needed to be reformed. And so we have the Banking Acts, we have the Securities Acts that come in, the Securities Acts of 1933, the Banking Act of 1934. These are brought together to allegedly protect the public, but, and this is really critical, what was established in the 1930s was what? An insurance company, where the government now became not the ideal of Jefferson, not the industrial trading magnate of the 19th century. It became the insurer of last resort for what? Bank deposits. In the banking reform that was allegedly a response to the Union of Banking and Insurance, we created an insurance company for banks. The ultimate irony, because that union then put in place the notion that there was something about America that was sovereign and incapable of default. And so, interrupted by the First World War, interrupted by the mass expansion of credit and debt throughout the 1920s, which led to the Great Depression, we the people decided that it was too big for us to solve the problems that we were seeing. So we the people decided in the 1930s to turn to the very same government, that we had found in the 1910s to be owned and operated and manipulated by corporations. That government, the government that we said was no longer representational, the government we said was no longer we the people, that government we turned to solve the problem of not feeling like we could do something. So what did we do? Well, we did some brilliant things, taking advantage of this amazing innovation that came out of 1913, the Federal Reserve, which is when we, the people, decided to let a group of private banks and insurance companies actually control all of our money, which was a decision we, the people, actually let happen. That decision, against the backdrop of that, we decided to introduce other really great innovations. And in 1933, to solve the problem of financial manipulations, we the people decided to create, are you ready for this? An insurance company to insure banks in the form of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, an insurance company for banking. We came up with the merger, the unholy alliance of the very things that merely 20 years earlier we had decided were being hijacked by the mercantile impulse. And we did nothing. We didn't say, well, hold on a minute. Maybe there's a fundamental problem here. Maybe turning to banking and insurance, maybe turning to that impulse is actually a bad idea when what we're trying to solve is a banking and insurance problem. It's probably a really bad idea to actually form an insurance company to make sure we protect the banks if what we're worried about is people not being protected from insurance companies and the banks? So what we do is we create a national scheme of banking and insurance. And then we do something else. As part of the New Deal, we create another thing, which is we don't trust corporations anymore, so what we're going to do is trust a government controlled by corporations to come up with something that controls our future. And so we create this thing called the Social Security Administration, which is to care for us. And what's going to happen is we're going to tax ourselves in the present so that we can take care of a future that's indeterminate. Man, that sounds a lot like life insurance, doesn't it? And we built a pension system that mirrored the life insurance system. And not surprisingly, what we did was we said, we the people are going to write checks, and we're going to send those checks to someplace. We don't actually know where it goes, but it goes into a trust fund. And we use the word trust very cunningly, because obviously, who wouldn't have confidence? If it's actually trust, and if it's a guarantee corporation, trust, guarantee, that sounds great. Of course I want to do that. But we never asked, where was the money going? What was it actually doing? And we didn't ask that because the answer in 1934, 1935, and 1936 would have been as odious as the answers when it was asked again in the 1970s, and that is, we were writing checks to an illiquid government agency that was buying, are you ready for this? United States debt. Now, why was it so important that we had debt? Well, it turns out that debt is a funny little animal. Debt actually lives uncorrelated to any other factors. Where markets rise and fall, where the fortunes of things can come up and down over a period of time, debt is a very fixed product, and it actually behaves in a very similar fashion over time. The Federal Reserve was set up so that it could stabilize the origination of debt, so that the private sector investor could actually harvest value from the taxpayer public. It's not surprising, by the way, that the 16th Amendment that allows us to tax the public at a federal level co-occurs with the establishment of a Federal Reserve that says our currency is going to be based on debt. Well, the faith and confidence in those two things are very clear. As long as you're paying taxes, we have confidence that we're going to take your money. That system works. Debt expands, and the monetary system continues to expand around that. And the pensions, the Social Security pensions, the corporate pensions, all the way up until the 1970s, those pensions were all doing what? They were actually feeding money back into the indebtedness of the country. Where does it sound like land of the free, home of the brave? Where is it that when we look at the actual Declaration of Independence, we look at the fact that one of the things that the First and the Second Continental Congress told us was intolerable was a system in which we, the people, were taxed in a way in which we were not represented. That was the core of what we said we were actually creating an experiment away from. And by 1933 and 1934, we built a system that was 100% driven by the very thing we said we rejected. See, this is the American experiment having been fully hijacked. This notion that there was a risk-free investment called the debt of America was in fact where we went after less than 2 generations of experimenting with a union. And the experiment with the union actually didn't last through the Great Depression, and the Great Depression then gives rise to the US stating that it has an economy that cannot default. It has an economy that will always grow, it will always produce, it will always outperform. And now we move forward and we realize that as things move along, these things, these debt instruments, all of these models that we build start to come due. You make a promise, you have to keep it. We hold these truths. What if we make promises that we don't intend to keep? What if we make promises knowing that we had no intention of keeping them? What if when Roosevelt said, we've got this New Deal, we're going to create a system in which no laborer is ever going to be out on their ear after they lose their job or after they're injured or after something goes wrong and there's a catastrophic event in their family. What if that Roosevelt knew that the system he was building was built on an empty promise? That maybe one day we, the people, would forget the promises that were made? What if that was part of the architecture? And the tragedy is, that's not a what if. We had created a system where the debt that we issued in 1913 actually came due about the time that something else happened. 30 years, let's see, 30 years, 1913, 1943. Where does that put us? That puts us into a world at war. We had no intention of repaying that debt. We had every intention of distributing the refinancing of that debt to someone else. If you go back and do the math on this, 1913 is the formation of the Federal Reserve. And if you remember that the long-dated assets, which were the assets that were supposed to be repayable in 30 years, began maturing in 1943, you see that very conveniently, the world created another event that masked the first default of America. Because the first default of America would have been evidenced were it not for the fact that the Second World War came along. And the Second World War created another destruction cycle for the infrastructure of Europe, taking out at the time, without question, the most innovative and industrial powerhouse in the world at the time, which was Germany. And we had the first default of America blinded and essentially camouflaged under the guise of the Second World War. The Second World War creates yet another impulse which allows America to make a statement to the rest of the world that says we're going to be this industrial powerhouse. And there's a really interesting event that takes place during the Second World War, which is the event that's the gathering at Bretton Woods. The gathering at Bretton Woods, if you really deeply understand what happened, was a gathering of Allied forces and others to get together to say, what does a world look like with America at the helm? Bretton Woods was an anonymous little gathering place for rich people, which was, not surprisingly, what we spoke about, this idea that we build a little mini resort castle away from everything. And Bretton Woods was exactly that. And we brought dignitaries from all over the world to come together and agree that if the Allies won the war, and if America looked like it was largely the biggest winner at the end of the Second World War, if those two conditions were met, then America would dictate to the rest of the world how the rest of the world had to live. So we call a meeting at Bretton Woods. We bring together the leaders of the then Allied world and we say, if we win the war, if we have the ability to succeed here, why don't we take we the people's money and why don't we make sure it becomes the ubiquitous trading currency of the world? And everybody in the world says, well, the British pound is gone, the Deutsche Mark is gone, all of the things that we used to think of as trading currencies are gone. So if we win, if we the Allies win, we will in fact create a monetary system around the world where the American debt-denominated currency becomes the standard of trade, the standard of commerce. That world was a contingency, but it was a contingency to offset the fact that we, the people, knew we couldn't pay our debts in 1943. So what we did was we created this whole instrument called war bonds, and we created all kinds of other ways to mask the refinancing of the first round of debt that we had no intention of paying off. Now, the funny thing about Bretton Woods is we didn't know we were going to win. We really didn't. We didn't know if we could pull this thing off. But what we said was, if we did, what would we want? We would want trade to be denominated in US dollars. Why would we want that? Well, it's because the life insurance and the gold adequacy was not enough to support the next turn of the economy. And so we had to create another way to get dollars into circulation to make the economy appear to grow. Why? Because we had to service the debt that we incurred, and we didn't have cash and currency to support that debt service, so we had to build a mechanism to reinforce that. So Bretton Woods becomes a very important part of the end of the American experiment in another instance. Because in Bretton Woods, we don't tell people hey, you know what? Come be part of this land of the free, home of the brave. No. What we say is, we, the arbiters of free and brave, will tell you, the rest of the world, how you should live. And Bretton Woods, as an event during the Second World War, is even more illogical because at the time, if you would have asked 10 years earlier, what's the strongest currency on the earth? No one would have said the US dollar. The US dollar hadn't been around that long. What they would have said was the Deutsche Mark or the British pound, because those had been around a long time and those actually had the confidence of economies backing them up. The US dollar didn't have that. But what we did have was we did have Bretton Woods and we did have oil. And by controlling Bretton Woods and controlling what happened in the Arabian Peninsula around oil, we were able to push the dollar onto global trade, such that at the end of the Second World War, we now had a system that had enough currency churn in it to prop up a debt-based economy. Almost. Almost. And it almost worked. But for that nasty little contrivance of the 30-year note. Because if you do the math, 1913 to 1943, 1943, 30 years later, gets us to oh crap, we see this one coming. 1943 to 1973, the next 30-year cycle. What happens there? Well, obviously, during that period of time, America has an industrial infrastructure that's growing. We have the automotive industry that's going all over the world. We have the electric and telecommunications industries that are going all over the world. We have the radio industry. We have the TV industry. We have all sorts of things happening. We have all of this growth. And the influence of America is spreading all over the world. And we also have that wonderful thing about the agency of warfare, which is a phenomenal economic engine. And it's growing and it's spreading. And all of these things are happening, and somewhere along the line, some folks in Europe start going, I'm not sure that this thing's working out so well. We're seeing things in America that look like this debt-based system isn't working. Because what we had done is part of the trading mechanism, we said, hey, industrial America is great, rest of the world is great, we need the rest of the world's resources to build the industrial greatness of America. Everything's going along swimmingly, and we still have this little nasty problem. And the nasty problem is, we had created a problem back in 1898. And that was the hegemony of gold. And we knew we didn't have enough gold to actually back everything that we said, but we had enough to back the fractional reserve of what we thought we were saying. And that was all supposed to work out really well until people started poking into this American experiment now as the economic hegemony of the world. And they started poking on it and they started saying, I wonder if that really does hold up. I wonder if the US economy really is what it says it is. I wonder if the dollar really is what it says it is. And in 1971, a terrible thing happens. And so in 1971, that world gets together and says, we don't have full faith and confidence in this thing called the American dollar. We don't have full faith and confidence in this thing called the US economy. We don't have full faith and confidence in what we see happening in this great American economic experiment. And the legacy of 1849, the legacy of 1898, the legacy of 1913, the legacy of the Morgan $20 gold note, the legacy of gold in America, that beautiful standard that says we the people are going to have gold as the full faith and confidence backstop for all the debt and all the promises we made, we the people decided on a weekend to tell the world, don't have faith and confidence in our gold, don't have faith and confidence in our dollar, have faith and confidence in the illusion of our perpetual growth. When the rest of the world starts doing a real assessment of how robust American economy really is, and the fact that now America doesn't represent land of possibility. America represents economic power. And that's a huge difference from where we started in 1773 and 1776 and 1815. We are now an economic power. We are actually a global power, and what gives us global power is the union of our monetary and economic system and our military system, and we've got those two things going gangbusters. The rest of the world looks at us and starts going, I'm not sure that that's a world that we agree with. I'm not sure that's a world that we actually want to see grow and manifest and be the dominant story in the world's stage. And what happens is that a couple of European countries threaten to demand a redemption of their gold. They don't believe in the dollar anymore. They don't believe in the American story anymore. They don't believe in the illusion anymore. And in 1971, the ultimate default on the promise of America happens. The president decides on a weekend to actually untether the currency from gold. Unilaterally declares that the gold standard is no longer a standard. There is no standard basis for our economy. The only thing that we have to work with, and the only thing the rest of the world has to work with, is a belief that America will keep its debt promises. America, the great human experiment, enters a debtor's prison, which is the very prison from which people left the British Isles and left Europe back in the 1700s to escape. And we actually formed, from our roots, the ultimate indebtedness model that is actually persistent to this day. So we have a world in which we start back in the beginning, where we escaped tyranny, we escaped the hegemony of banks and financiers and monarchs and patrons, and we create a system in 1971 that becomes a system of pure debt. And in a weekend, we erased the gold standard. And we could do it. We could do it. Because by the time we were prepared to do that, the world was addicted to our dollar in oil trade. The world was addicted to our dollar in arms trade. The world was addicted to our dollar in automotive trade and industrial trade. And it was so addicted that it couldn't find a way out. And it's not by accident that we go off of the gold standard, which linked us to European economies. And in 1972 and 1973, the Nixon administration decided to do what? Open our debt-buying freedoms to Asia. People talk about ping-pong diplomacy, where Nixon opened up China, and they talk about it as though there's some sort of ephemeral beauty and largesse on the part of America. But what we don't talk about was the fact that we needed new buyers for our debt, because Europe had said we don't believe in the future of the economy of the Americas, and we needed somebody to buy our debt. And it turns out that what really happened when Nixon went off the gold standard was he opened up the purchasing of our debt and liberalized the amount of purchasing of debt that could be done by a foreign interest. He opened it up necessarily to get China involved in the purchasing of our debt because we needed a new buyer. We, the people, had run out of credit. So we had to turn to someone else. Because we didn't turn it inwards, we actually went outwards. And we, the people, decided to start a bill of debt that is now, today, as we all talk to each other, that bill is now $18 trillion. $18 trillion. Now, $18 trillion sounds like a big number for most of us. Most of us don't have that in our checking accounts. Most of us can't really think about what a trillion anything looks like. But $18 trillion sounds like a pretty big number. Thank God we have somebody who knows how to run businesses that's now running our country, right? That's what we're all thinking. That's what we hope we're thinking. But here's the tiny little problem. 18 trillion isn't the number. Because yes, that's the debt that we have. But there's another problem. That promise that we made, that promise that said we were going to take care of our elderly, that promise that said we were going to take care of our pensions, that promise that said we, the people, were going to actually make sure land of the free, home of the brave meant pursuit of happiness long into after employment, that wonderful world of the retirement phase of our lives, that world that now is the reality for 60 million people, that world is a world that was filled with promises that were made by the New Deal, by Roosevelt. But here's the problem. The problem is that world runs out of money. And by running out of money, I mean goes to zero. Goes to zero by 2037. But before 2037, in fact, if it's going to make it to 2037 and run to zero, this year, right now, as you're watching this movie, this moment in time is the moment in time where to get to that world where we run out of the promise in 2037, we have to start diminishing now, right now. We the people have to now say that promise we made, we're not going to keep. Let's talk about the implications of that for a moment. That means that 60 million Americans right now are going to, within the matter of weeks, effectively lose the ability to spend about 20% of the money they thought they were entitled to. 20%. Wiped out. Why? Well, we thought it was going to be 12%. In fact, the official numbers said it would be 12.7%. We'd have to reduce benefits by 12.7% sometime around 2016 or 2017. We thought it was going to be 12%. But that's before the Federal Reserve decided to reduce interest rates so that banks and insurance companies could be stabilized in 2008. The funny thing is, we the people let that happen. We the people sat and did nothing while trillions of dollars were pumped away from the future of the promise of America and pumped into these beautiful institutions that we all have come to know and love as the insurance and banking systems of the United States and of Europe and of China. We did it. And no one told us that when interest rates went down and we saw the stock markets go up, so we were told we were in this great recovery, no one told us that that recovery came with a price tag. No one told us that one day that price tag would come due. No one told us that when we actually saw interest rates going to near zero, what that meant was the income that the debt was supposed to generate was not going to flow anymore, and that income means that the Social Security programs and the pension programs and all of the benefit programs and all of the actuarial models that were built on an assumption that we would have roughly 3% or 2.5% returns on all of that government-guaranteed risk-free money, that assumption was set aside so that we could bail out financial institutions in 2008, so that we could prop up equity markets in 2010, so that we could create the illusion of a recovery by 2012. And now, here we are. We're sitting with a world that's insolvent. Our world's insolvent. And the very debtor's prison of Europe that most of our first immigrants came from is in fact the exact same thing that we've now created for all of us. We now live in a debtor's prison. $18 trillion of national debt. $6.5 trillion of unfunded liabilities for the deposits of our money in the banks, where the FDIC does not have enough money to actually control a run on the banks. So if there is a run on the banks run out of money. Oh, but don't mind that 6-point-something trillion dollar shortfall, because the FDIC reassures the public that it can go to the Treasury and borrow $500 billion to cover a $6 trillion liability. The math doesn't work. But don't worry, it's not just the banking system, it's not just the national debt. It's also this beautiful reality that says that we have this massive thing called Social Security, where we've made $17 trillion of promises that we're not going to keep. We've actually indebted ourselves, we've actually promised a future, and we've actually insured the present with an illiquid structure that now costs us more than the total asset value of America. Today, we're bankrupt. Not kind of bankrupt, actually bankrupt. Our liabilities exceed our assets. But that's fine, because we can solve this problem, right? We can go to the big corporations, these wonderful behemoths, these companies that actually were built as part of this phenomenal American experiment, this great limitation of liability, this great entrepreneurial impulse, this great America that said, we the people will actually take an Adam Smith model, we'll put it in the fertile soil of America, and we'll make a corporate success out of all this. That we the people, that enthusiastic promise of a future, we can clearly go to the corporations. Those corporations that now are, in fact, the patrons of the world that we actually have created, we can go to them and probably, I don't know, ask them to maybe help make something work, because somewhere along the line, that ought to work. Except for one thing. The corporations. The very beneficiaries of the system we created. Those corporations decided to offshore their assets years ago. I wonder if they actually saw something coming. I wonder if they saw on a horizon a world where this illiquidity that we're in now maybe would go after their assets, and I wonder what they did. I wonder where Apple parked its money. I wonder where GE parked its money. I wonder where IBM parked its money. I wonder where any of these companies parked their money. And why is it that suddenly we the people, that great American experiment, that great Adam Smith thing that said we're going to have this great world in which finance and corporations are going to replace monarchies and tyranny, I wonder why it is that most of those assets are now back in Ireland and in British domiciled properties. Did we the people actually get freedom from anything? Or was this giant 230-year experiment not an experiment about humanity? Was this giant experiment a way to hijack several 100 million people's lives and the wealth of a nation, and actually make sure that all of those resources actually don't stay at home, but in fact are now once again safely in the hands of the Isles, from which we allegedly declared independence? You know, the funny thing is, Congress, right now, is debating whether there should be an amnesty that allows corporations to bring back assets that haven't been taxed. And apparently that's too politically volatile a topic for you, the American. You couldn't tolerate it if Apple had to pay tax. You couldn't tolerate it if IBM had to pay tax. You couldn't tolerate it if GE had to pay tax, because it wouldn't be in your interest. Except for the fact that because those assets are now overseas, they are now kept from being able to be part of the solution set that says we the people are going to now start breaking promises to we the people. And we've got no place to turn. Because the money that actually was created by this great experiment, the actual wealth that was created by the experiment, is no longer within the shores of America. That wealth is gone. And since that wealth is gone, the ability to retrieve it is also gone. We, the people, have to solve that problem. Now, by now, you've choked on your last bit of popcorn, you've slurped down your last little bit of Coke, and you're sitting there going, we, the people, have been had. And there's probably a bad guy somewhere out there that did all of this. And the answer is, we did it to ourselves. We did it. We believed in a world where there was always something better beyond. We believed in a world where somehow or another our fear of death needed to change how we lived. We believed in a world where we had to look to ourselves rather than look to our neighbors and to our network to support us. We believed in a world where we wanted to surrogate our responsibility, because even though we got rid of a monarch and we got rid of a pope and we got rid of an archbishop, we got rid of all of those things, we still believed that there was someone somewhere else out there that was responsible for our lives. And the wake-up call that we have right now is to be accountable. There isn't a somewhere out there. There's now. There is this moment right now. We, the people, have a failed experiment. We were part of that experiment, which means we actually were part of the failure. The great news about an experiment is it's just that. It's just an experiment. You learn the bits that work, you learn the bits that don't work. And we can do something with it. The great thing about where we are now is we, the people, have a chance to do something for the first time. And that is to go back to a hilltop in Monticello and read that document. Read that we, the people, and we hold these truths. And when we say that all men are created equal, we don't put an asterisk next to that and say, except for the slaves, except for the Indians, except for the people who don't look like us, except for the cheap laborers from India and China, except for. If we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, then all of us are. And we're all in this together. And there is no version of skin color or ethnicity or anything else that can stand in the way of us working together. So we, the people, can stand together. If we, the people, believe that this is about endowed by inalienable rights, then we have to see a world in which tolerance, that principle that says that your liberty, in fact, does not impinge on my liberty and mine does not impinge on yours, so we better figure out how each other can live together. So liberty is actually something that is in fact part of how we treat each other, that tolerance is how we engage with each other, that we don't pick the populations that we don't like, that we don't close our borders to people who aren't like us because we fear them. We actually have to understand what they have to offer. We have to understand who they are and what makes them tick, and figure out what bits of them, not just their kebabs, not just their tacos, not just whatever it's the bits that we can actually eat in our own homes, but what is it the bits about those people that actually can contribute to us, and what is it about us that can contribute to them? Liberty and the pursuit of happiness is actually not the pursuit of things. See, the industrial model told us that the pursuit of happiness was how much stuff we had. A car in every garage, a chicken in every pot. The New Deal that said stuff was the arbiter of success and happiness. Success and happiness is not the stuff. Look at the person sitting next to you right now. Look at them. Happiness is the fact that you can sit in peace next to them. Hold the hand of the person who you came to see this movie with right now. Reach out and hold their hand. Feel them. Feel their vitality. Feel the fact that you live in a place and you're experiencing a moment right now, in this present moment right now, where you can actually touch another human being, and that human being is not a virtual hologram that is delivered by some corporate experience in augmented reality. That's a person who actually has blood pumping through their arteries and their veins. That's a person who's breathing and animated and living, and they walked in the theater with you, and with any luck, they're going to walk out with you. That's the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness that says we actually are engaged, and with that engagement, examine what you're doing right now. Are you waiting to live until you retire? The great news is, give it up. The wonderful thing about this promise being broken is it was a shitty promise in the first place. You didn't need someone else to take care of your life after you were done working for someone else. You actually needed to take care of your life now. And if you took care of your life now, if you pursued happiness now, if you engaged in liberty now, if you were part of a community now, you wouldn't need to worry about the what happens in the future, because it turns out that that community would embrace and love you. Live. Be at liberty. Pursue happiness. And we, the people, can thereby form a more perfect union. The Treaty of Ghent? Treaty of Ghent is when the British and American trade resumption started, and the bank interchangeability was the core of that treaty, so that you could actually move money between Britain and America, who had just been at each other at war, and they decided to normalize trade relationships, but they interchangeably set up a joint transfer banking system. And so they built that system exactly for this asset transfer that moved all the corporate assets overseas. Yeah, I know, it's great.
It's coming over real.
Is this a horror story?
Vampires, dead people, leaking ink. In the 1730s, David Martin, ironically, got on the ship Molly and sailed from the UK over to the port of Philadelphia and received, as our documents show, received a land grant from William Penn's son. And the land grant was to essentially give him farming land at what was then the margin of kind of the known world, which is actually about 60 miles, 70 miles west of Philadelphia. So it gives you a sense of the bold edge of the world was, you know, a few days walk away. And he went and set up a farm and started farming, and to this day you can see the line of graves of David Martins all lined up, so I feel very at home when I go back to the homestead. There's a whole bunch of remembrances of mortality there.